everybody. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here so early at 9:30. So you'll know probably I'm Joanna Mcgregor and I'm a musician, and I look after a lot of young people at the Royal Academy of Music. So I have particular interest in access, education, and how to allow them to be nurtured, to push them out into the wider world and become leaders in their field. Actually, when these young people turn up, I say to them, I expect you to play the piano brilliantly, but actually what I want you to do is change the world and try and get them to learn to be artist leaders. So I've got a secret mission to turn them all into composers, conductors, and festival directors, actually, because I think that way you change the game. There's a bit of a tradition amongst women of being interpreters of other people's music, and I think that's all fine, but I think it'd be even better to take on authority, which actually lies sometimes in other roles as well. So what we're going to do this morning is I'm with this wonderful panel of distinguished and gifted women, and we're going to just let each of them speak for about 5 minutes, just give you a sense of what their thoughts are and what they're working on at the moment. Briefly, and we'll have brief interaction, and then obviously we're opening it up to you. So do take any notes as soon as somebody says something that really speaks to you. So we'll ask people to speak in the order of the programme. So Nana, you're going to start for us first.
Wow. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to thank the organisers for inviting me and our chair for the wonderful performance last night. Do you agree?
Yeah. Bravo.
I think it was Claudia Jones who said, a people's art is the genesis of their culture. And I want to delve into the publishing world and my 30 years experience in that world and how that has shaped me, and also made me more aware that we need to do more work to get more people who look like me into the arts. I worked in corporate publishing for 12, 13 years at one of the big educational publishers at Oxford, Heinemann Educational Publishers. And for 14, almost 50 years, they published the African and Caribbean Writer Series, which was sold all around the world. It's world-renowned for publishing the best in terms of writing from Africa. And for all those 40 years, it never occurred to anybody that women should be included on the management board. So I came along and decided that I want to take on that challenge. And it was a very difficult challenge. But I am not one for taking no for an answer. So I got there in the end. I thought I would start by briefly quoting a few statistics from the publishing industry. A recent socio-demographic study on employment in publishing in the United Kingdom, men made up 36% of the publishing workforce in 2020. The majority of publishing employees are women, not only in junior roles, but also in executive leadership roles and in senior management. I think this is brilliant, and we should all be very happy about that. More than 70% of the roles in departments such as publicity, marketing, editorial, and human resources are held by women. This is proof that the women form the backbone of the publishing industry, but one cannot say the same for women of color. And I want to challenge us today with my presentation about what we can do to redress that historical imbalance. Because like I said, I've been in the industry for 30 years. And I'm now beginning to ask why we are not seeing more faces like mine represented in the industry. But I also want to say briefly that publishing is not alone in this respect. You know, the arts in general need to do a little bit more work to make sure that we have a certain balance in terms of representing the whole of our society. Because the people, the editors and the publishers and the typesetters and the designers who make the decisions, they are an important part of what goes into making a book. And if we don't have representation from these
ethnic minorities on that board, in that workforce, it means their voices, their stories, their histories are being overlooked and not actually published. And that, for me, is a huge worry, because I'm raising a young mixed-race child and now grandchildren. And I think it's important that we teach them that there are so many wonderful things about being in this country. For instance, when I left Ghana at the tender age of 17 and came here, I have been given the opportunity to get the best education anybody can wish for. And people have championed me. I'll talk briefly about how I got into publishing. I try not to be too long. And I think we need to do more to help others to gain access, because this is the best place for education and work and all the good things if you have the opportunity, if you're given the opportunity to get into the industry. I think one of the things I want to mention briefly, even more concerning, I think, than the percentage of women working, almost half of the respondents have experienced mental health problems. And we're talking about ethnic minorities working in the industry who have responded and said they've experienced very serious health problems. That is a concern for me. But I'm not surprised, because I had quite a tough time. And my husband, who is here, will bear me out. I used to come home and fume at him, just fume at him for the way the system is, structured. And it wasn't his fault. But he was the one that I had to hand, so he took all the... he took the brunt of my anger. And lo and behold, Heinemann decided that they had had enough of publishing new writing in the African and Caribbean Writers Series. So in 2002, they decided to stop publishing new work. And as the submissions editor, I was the first port of call for manuscripts coming in, and I was the first person who was made redundant from that department. I was fortunate I was able to negotiate a reasonable redundancy package. I went home and licked my wounds for about a couple of weeks, and I think one day my husband came back from school, and I remember this very well because I was standing at the top of the stairs and he was standing downstairs, and he said, "How have you been? How's work been?" And I blurted out, "I'm going to start my own publishing house." And he looked at me and sort of scratched his head, and he said, "Have you had anything to eat today?" And I completely ignored that question, and I said, "Did you hear me? I am going to start my own publishing house." And he said, "Have you been drinking?" The rest, as they say, is history. But it is incredibly tough. I think he realized very quickly that I was taking on something that would be more than, impossible for me to achieve. But I was completely naive and went into this industry not knowing what to expect, because I was working as an editor. So I wasn't really concerned with the finance aspect of what was going into publishing. I soon found out. It was a shock to my system. So I started looking around for grants and support. And I was very fortunate to apply to the Arts Council England, came to my aid with a generous startup funding. And that helped IABIA at the initial stages. So I'm very grateful for that. I need to give them a big applause for doing that. 3 years later, they pulled away my funding. And actually, it was at the time when I was awarded my MBE. I was awarded an MBE on the one hand, and then the next couple of months, I was told that funding for IABIA would no longer be available. But IABIA has pressed on regardless. We've published award-winning and incredible voices, and I have worked consciously, tirelessly to champion women writers, because I want to deepen the feminist credentials of IABIA. I was very aware at Heinemann that the men wrote first, and the women were sort of taken on in a tokenistic way. And I was very conscious of bringing forth voices of Black women, women of color, into the equation, so that we can also experience what they go through in terms of trying to get into this industry. And I have to put my hand up and say, I got into the industry because one of my husband's friends was working. We had worked in Nigeria as expatriates, and he came back and he got a job at Heinemann as a sales director. So when we came back, and my husband asked him if there was a job available, he said, "Oh yeah, bring her." So he arranged for me to be interviewed, and I was hired on the spot. Now, last night, a young lady, Miss Yeboah, asked a very important question about how does one actually get into the industry if one doesn't have these contacts. Who you know certainly worked for me. Those contacts work for me. But I'm aware that not everybody is as fortunate as I am to have those contacts. And I must also say that the Arts Council and also the British Council have been making interventions about diversity and trying to open doors for people of color. But this has been going on for all the 30 years I've been working in publishing. And I'm still not seeing faces like mine represented in publishing. So I'm going to throw it up to you today to maybe help us out and make some suggestions of how we can make the publishing industry more diverse. And I want to end very, very briefly by quoting one of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. And she said something that I really, really like. She said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, this is Shirley Chisholm. She said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. That's where I am at the moment, you know. But we need, as women, we need other women to help us. And I'm going to rely on you to help me out. Thank you.
Anna, thank you. That was really wonderful. You're such a passionate and sort of experienced advocate, and I do want to talk later on about confidence and owning your experience and having confidence in your experience, because you come across at the moment as very confident, but both you and I know, we all know that confidence is very hard won amongst women, and you have to learn how to show people how good you are, and this is a real issue when you're in your 20s, I think, and 30s. It goes on and on and on. You're only in your 20s. You give me that look.
30s and 40s and 50s. Yeah.
So next I'm going to turn to Susanna, and you're going to speak to us about Sound of Music.
Thanks so much, and thank you for a wonderful introduction. It's great to be here, and thanks so much for the introduction. It's still... it's quite overwhelming to be in person with other people, and it's also a kind of rare treat to get properly dressed and not just wear a nice top with my pyjama bottoms. So I had to remember how to do all of that. It's also, we were just saying before, I haven't done this sort of in-person panel thing for a long time, so please do bear with me. The confidence thing doesn't go away as you get older, it changes, but yeah, I'm not quite used to this, so bear with me, be patient. I thought I'd start by just saying a few words about Sound of Music. Some of you may not know the organisation that I'm Chief Executive of. So Sound of Music is the UK's national organisation for new music. We work to support and champion new music and the composers who create it across the country. We work across many different genres and at all ages. So we run programmes in artist development, we also run programmes in education, and we do broader campaigning and public engagement work as well, which I'll come back to later. In this introductory thing, I guess there's three areas I want to cover, and I too will start with some statistics, because the statistics we heard from Maria, from Nana Ayabia just now, and these ones show that there is still a problem. So there was a report published quite recently by an organisation called Données in Musica, which surveyed the programmes of 100 orchestras across 27 countries across the world. And they found that of all the concerts that had happened, 11.4% of the concerts included work by women. And then of all the works that were performed across all those orchestras in all those countries, 5% of the works performed were by women. And worse than that, of all of the works performed, 1.1% were performed by female composers of colour, which is, you know, it's just terrible. And people tell me that there isn't a problem anymore, and it's like, well, there really is. Another interesting research that was actually undertaken by a Cambridge student a few years ago, and she looked at new works commissioned and performed by the proms. And it's easy to go for the proms because they're so high profile, but I think this probably applies across the piece as well. But she found that the average length of work commissioned from female composers was shorter and often smaller in scale than those of their male counterparts. And, you know, I know that a miniature, that size isn't everything. I do know that. But still, it is telling that of the world premieres that the Proms Commission, so the pieces that were entirely in their control, the average length of a work by a female composer was 11 minutes, and by a male composer was 19 minutes. There is something about the amount of space that we are allowed to take up. So there is still a problem, and I guess the two things I wanted to talk about now is firstly the kind of resistance that I've faced in some of the campaigning work we've done at Sound and Music, and I think it's interesting to sort of start to unpick why is this so hard? Why is this so hard to shift when we know this is not right? If we accept that talent is equally distributed amongst the population, regardless of your gender, your ethnicity, where you're from, if you accept that talent is everywhere, then why aren't we seeing it reflected everywhere on our stages? Why isn't it representative in what we are presented when we go to a performance? I also want to come to some practical steps of things we've done at Sound and Music, which maybe, you know, I know that this conference really wants to find some practical things we can take forward, and hopefully that will be food for thought. So the resistance one, so we started campaigning about this, I guess, back in 2014, 2015, once we'd started looking at our data and realising there was a problem. And I quickly encountered what I would describe as surprising levels of anger from colleagues in the industry that we were doing this. And there were a range of accusations, but the most common one was that we didn't care about quality. So this is something I'm sure many of us working in this field with have come across, that you start to talk about making things more equal, and suddenly there's a question mark about the quality of the work you're talking about. I don't, you know, it's like I have never compromised on artistic quality, and this is maybe something to explore in more detail as well. But there is so much great work and talent out there. The idea that there's a list of composers and there's like the best one, the second best, third best is sort of nonsense. There is many more talented people out there than we're capable of supporting. But this quality thing comes back again, and it sort of takes odd forms. I've actually lost count of the number of times I've had people come up to me, and I've been working in this field for a number of decades now, and people come and say, I'm doing a programme and it's got you'll like this, it's got a female composer in it, as if I'm supposed to give a sort of a gold star for feminism or something like that. But this is a sort of part of the same thing, that it's somehow kind of different or sort of wrong or kind of peculiar to be doing this work. And I think part of this is around, they're still very in music, and I guess particularly in classical music, and Sound and Music isn't just working in classical music at all, but it is part of what we do. There are very embedded notions of what greatness looks like and sounds like, and what the people who create it look and sound like as well. And you know, I feel it's my life's work to be sort of chipping away at that notion of what it looks like, and also the notion of an established canon, that the works that we hear, the reason there aren't works by women is because they didn't make the final cut, when there are many reasons why works get neglected, of which quality is just one of about 6 reasons why works get taken forward or not. So I think all of that is a real sort of real resistance, real barriers to change. There are a lot of vested interests in keeping things as they are. There's a lot of money in it. So the sort of commercial publishers, the commercial agents, it's really in their interest to keep with the status quo and to keep with the canon as it is and not challenge it at all. But of course, that's not great for the art, for artists or for audiences, or for the future of the art forms that we love. So finally, I just want to touch briefly on some of the work we've done at Sound and Music. I talked about getting our data in order. We are very transparent about our data with regards to diversity and equality. We publish it, we set targets, we hold ourselves to account. since we started doing this, we've seen the percentage of women we're working with across our programs increase from about 30% to 52% last year. And we really kind of work hard to make sure that happens. It's just not acceptable for us not to be representative in the composers we work with. As I say, we've done lots of campaigning, so we've really talked about this publicly. And then lastly, we started looking at the barriers that people face, that women face. And of course, as soon as you start looking at barriers, you realise that those barriers are compounded if you're a composer of colour, if you're a disabled composer. So if you start looking at barriers, you realise that they are many and they are compounded according to your backgrounds. So we've worked with composers and partners in the industry to create a set of what we call fair access principles. We've got about 22 organisations signed up. And they are basically a set of guidelines for running accessible and fair recruitment processes. And that can be anything. Anytime you're having to make a selection, you can apply these principles. They're on our website, but they include things like, very obvious things like don't charge a fee. But they also include things like don't have an age limit, which is age limits are very discriminatory, particularly towards women. They include things like be really clear who is making the decision and on what criteria. And they also include not having anonymous selection, which is the most controversial one. And people get very angry about that and say, but that's so unfair because anonymous selection is the only fair. And there's a whole body of research that says that is not the case. If you really want to shift the background of the people you're working with, you have to know who you're talking to. And you have to know about the access they've previously had and the potential they have in the future. So you cannot just make decisions based on the opportunity people have had. If people have had privileged opportunity to work with professional musicians, for example, they will come over better on a first sight. But actually, if you look forward and think about potential, that feels more important, which is why you have to know who people are and where they're from. So all of this is ongoing work, and there's much I hope we can open up in discussion. I should say also that, going back to the quality question, this has been an incredibly vibrant, joyful thing for us to do as an organisation. It's been a really good thing to bring the team together. I feel the work that we're creating is incredibly, there's such a wide variety and it feels incredibly lively and vibrant. So it has brought us nothing but joy, and it makes me feel really sort of optimistic about what music can be if more of us really embrace the commitment to change. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Susanna. Gosh, if that's you not quite ready to do public speaking, I don't know what you must be like when you're... That's fantastic. And I recognise everything that you're saying. Eleanor Alberga, who is one of the composers I played last night, she was asked to do a piece for the last night of the Proms, which is meant to be, the really big thing, the huge audience, and her piece was 9 minutes long. For huge forces, BBC chorus, BBC symphony orchestra, so a lot of people on stage, but it was short. Yeah. It's exactly what you're saying, which is that you're allowed in, but so you don't get much space.
No, you're okay. Not too long.
But not too long, don't go on too long. Thanks. So, Rachel, thank you. You're going to speak to us.
I am. Thank you both. And actually, it makes it really nice. It makes it quite easy for me because Nana and Susanna have covered quite a few things, both that I wanted to remark on and also that I recognise. And also following on from that idea of what you do once you've got into the space, because we divide, don't we? So we're on either side of those doors. Either we're trying to get access, or we have got a foot in the door, we've got some kind of access, and what do we do with that responsibility of passing it on once we're there? And I think those two things are coming out quite clearly from the conversations we had yesterday and we're having this morning. I've just recently finished and published a book about Sylvia Pankhurst, who said, love and enthusiasm are the great two moving factors which make life worth living. This I aver in spite of all the materialists. And Sylvia Pankhurst may be a name known to you as a militant suffragette. She was the most militant of the suffragettes. She went to prison 13 times. She was force-fed She led mass movements. Lenin said of her that hundreds and millions of people around the world follow and are inspired by Comrade Pankhurst. And we know that side of her as an activist. And she, on the other hand, was an artist. And she was an artist who got a scholarship to the Manchester School of Art, where I discovered last night Maria Borshaw's daughter is now studying, which is a lovely continuity. And she then got a national scholarship, because although that she was middle class, there wasn't enough money in the family. Her mother, Emmeline, was a widow and a single mother with three girls and a son, and bills to pay and a movement to run. And Sylvia got a national exhibition. She won a place at the Royal College of Art. And when she got there, she was very good at what she did, but she also started noticing about how the selection process is, how many women started, what their class was, what their race was, who they were, how there was then a selection program of how many of them were getting through to the next stages or were getting the plum jobs and so on and so on. So she started causing arguments. Fortunately, by then she was having a passionate love affair with Keir Hardie, who was the new and first leader of the Labour Party. So she got him as a young, feisty student to ask some questions in the House of Commons. That really pissed off the president and the head of her college, who singled her out. And she started mobilising within the college whilst she was also busy, as was called, rousing London, working with Annie Kenny on East London stuff. The point is that throughout her career, there was this dilemma, or in her early career, there was this dilemma of, she thought she was going to be an artist, and she was a very good artist, but yet there was this cause, there was this imperative of what had to be done, that in order to pursue what she wanted to be, she had to liberate herself and her sisters and her mothers first. And that is a sort of almost like a sort of myth. It's like a sort of founding myth of what we constantly have to do. I remember as a young undergraduate student studying English literature, this was in the mid-80s, and I wanted to do my seminar presentation on Virginia Woolf, and the seminar presentations were 30 minutes, and when I started giving my paper on Virginia Woolf and actually Dorothy Richardson, and making the argument about stream of consciousness being Dorothy Richardson and not being Joyce and so on, I was interrupted by my male professor and asked why I was presenting a paper on Dorothy Richardson and Virginia Woolf in this course on modernism. As a consequence, I had to spend the next 15 minutes constructing my argument of why I was doing that and why these Green Book, Penguin, Virago modern classics produced recently by Carmen Khalil that had brought to light Dorothy Richardson again made this viable to put on my course that had not been on the reading list. By the time I'd done that, I had 10 minutes left to then address the writing, the artistic content, the qualities thereof, and so on. And in a way, for me, that's become a paradigm of much of my life, in the same way that a Sylvia Pankhurst or any of us think, is there a dilemma, a tension between these things, but am I doing these things at the same time? And Sylvia had at college, she had a couple of friends who said, well, yes, we care, women friends, and out gay young male friends like, Austin Osman Spare, and they'd say, yes, we really care about this stuff too, but, we're artists and we'll express ourselves that way. And so people can be quite different in that way, but I wanted to just pause on that to draw a direct connection between the way that art illustrates and animates political activism and indeed revolution and change and interventions. And I was thinking this morning when we had that wonderful tour around looking at the collection, I was sort of had a little Sylvia sitting on my shoulder, sort of thinking squinting at what she would think of seeing all these women artists who had come from different places and been doing different things being collected here. But the tactics and the methods that are used by young people and middle-aged people and elderly people, people across genders, race and classes in Extinction Rebellion and in Black Lives Matter, which have their origins in much longer movements, which are current expressions of things that have lasted much longer, have a direct relationship to these ways in which art and activism are intimately linked. And we know that when we use, you can hear now in the popular press people talk about, oh, well, Extinction Rebellion is sort of using the methods of the suffragettes and so on. That's not being force-fed and you know, in prison. It's about using colour, and it's about using creativity, and it's about the theatre of politics. And so I think the reason I've taken what might sound like a little bit of a detour to get to this point is that those are the things that we're looking to support, that we're looking to find, how do you pass this on? How do you create the networks that interpret what the world is for the new generation and how people are dealing with and interpreting those struggles and those challenges in a way that culture, which can be the most creative and opening and sharing between all people, but also has the most vested interests. The people who sit on top of this. There's a reason why there are culture wars, because as long as you hang on to the narrative of culture, as long as you're saying what culture is and who owns it, right? You can have all your bourgeois liberal parliamentary democracy over here and everybody arguing about politics, but the real place where the power is taking place in terms of its visible invisibility is in terms of who owns that. And last night and this morning, Barbara has repeatedly said, let's be thinking about outcomes. Let's be thinking about what are our interventions? What are the things we want to sort of put out there at this stage? Because I sit here and I think, wow, how things have moved on 100 years since the suffragettes. There is absolutely no doubt. We can see, we can mark the changes. And yet at the same time, we really should be further along. And as I think, I was going to say someone said last night, but it might have been everyone, actually, those of us who are middle-aged, feeling a bit impatient now, feeling a bit fed up, and yet that's exactly what almost middle-aged Sylvia Pankhurst said when her teenage daughters became rebellious, and it's like, okay, let's start this movement. And my one point, I think, is that we should not be scared of affirmative action. And that if we believe, which we do, you were talking about it, Susanna, perceptions of art. Who makes it? Wonderfully, some of Sylvia Pankhurst's Northern Tour paintings have been bought by the Tate Modern. Well, no surprises why that suddenly happened. You met her last night, right? And they are absolutely beautiful and brilliant paintings. But that the perception of who produces, that people are already seeing and hearing something different, or you're taking up too much space. But that if we believe, which I think we do by now, and we know that meritocracy is a myth, then we can't leave the other bit, the big question mark with a hole next to it, the logical correlative to that, empty. And I think that affirmative action is something that we really, really need to reconsider. And it is about who and that's not just who's being invited to interview, but it's also about who the committee is who's doing the interview, actually doing that in that way. And it's really quite straightforward, and I've found that it's something that sounds very controversial in different places and not in others. I come from South Africa, and my whole country changed during my lifetime. There was a black terrorist prisoner who apparently was going to either die in prison or cause bloody civil war, who was sitting on Robben Island. And he was cheerfully called a terrorist by pretty much anybody I ever came across, in public life in Britain. And he's now sainted as one of the great figures of the 20th century. Things change and people change. And when we had the transition in South Africa, yeah, things are tough. But when you had the transition, there was a very, very clear and interesting thing that was done, and that was affirmative actions. People simply said, we have arts, we have culture, we have a thriving scene of music and art and culture and poetry that has been taking place over hundreds of years, but it's been completely repressed under apartheid. And the solution was on that, but also on the board of De Beers diamonds, we will have, right, for a period, not for eternity, we will have a generation of a quota system. Because you actually, if you have 300 years or 200 years of imbalance, you actually have to do something to correct the balance. And this idea that somehow we can pussyfoot around that, final story, when I went on from being a student, I told you a story about being a student, I was an academic for a while, and I, at one stage, was admissions officer. And I could see exactly what was going on in terms of who the students were, graduate students, right? Who the graduate students were being picked. I was in a college that prided itself on being relatively open and not too sort of, only taking people from private school as undergraduates and so on, and it was pretty mixed. And then it went from undergraduate to graduate, and suddenly it was mostly Oxbridge and pretty much all white. So I applied my own affirmative action program as admissions officer, breaking every single rule. Right? Obviously, I probably should have been disciplined or at least sacked for it. Where people who knew I was doing it was like, well, this is terrible bias, and you're applying these awful kind of sort of sectarian measures and so on. And I think that argument has gone on for a long time, but it's just something I wonder if we've slightly could put to the forefront again, that we talk about leadership, and that's absolutely correct. And we use sort of languages of inclusion, but in terms of how we actually get there, some measures which would say, if we have affirmative action in terms of our institutions and processes, and I couldn't agree more with you, the festival director, the programmer, that's why I took a deviation from creating to go and do that, because you set the agenda, you curate, and you become the person that says, I'm going to say that is the thing that is legitimate. But in order to get there, and in order to connect those voices through these mass global movements, and they are, and the alternatives are not, if they don't get incorporated in this way, the alternatives are going to express themselves in different, and quite naturally and rightly, in different kinds of rebellions. But nobody's going to give the power away. We have to take it. So my pitch is to put affirmative action back on the agenda across all forms of hiring and those kinds of creative committees.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, so we're all feeling very activist up here, and which will help us find some outcomes. So let's throw this open, please, and have lots of wonderful questions. Who would like to start? Yes, thanks. Can you tell us who you are?
My name is Joanna. I'm an artist and a writer. I thank you so much. I really enjoyed all your presentations. I feel really inspired. I just wanted to pick up on that very last thing you said. I think it's really radical to hear someone make the case for affirmative action. I think this is something I work in. I'm a lecturer at university in the arts, at an arts university, and there was a lot of talk about decolonisation. There's a lot of talk about a need to be an anti-racist university, to have diversity. But when it comes to the actual hiring, there are all kinds of excuses as to why it doesn't happen. As maybe discussed, they weren't the right candidates. No one applied. We didn't have time. There was a rush. Ranging all the way to we don't see race, so we actually didn't know he was black and he was white. It's really great. But the last thing you said about we have to take the power, no one's going to give it up. Is there a place for people to relinquish power? Because we're in a room right now of people who are incredibly powerful, mainly white people, who are already in these positions, who are on these panels, who are still in the positions of being the ones to choose. And I wonder if there is space for people who have historically had power to do some of that relinquishing, so that it doesn't always have to be the women of colour, it doesn't have to be the working class women, it doesn't have to be the queer, and let's not forget those who are disabled as well, constantly doing the work, because at the end of the day, as Toni Morrison says, it's a distraction, and it's not what we want to do.
Thank you. Nana, do you want to, would you reply reply to
I
that?
think
Nana?
that is a very, very powerful intervention. What you've got to also take on board is the issue that Susan brought up about the issue of quality. The moment you start talking about affirmative action or putting into place a system that will enable historically, disregarded people to get into the equation, people bring the issue of quality. And it is almost, as if they're saying, well, black and brown people are not capable, so we are not in a position to give them that, It is a red herring. And often by people who are jealous or selfish or not really sensitive enough to pick up what is happening. I said something about mental health issues, especially in the publishing industry. So many people, brown and black people, have been suffering from this. And, the thing is, it brings on this nervousness, this nervous negative energy. You work in an organization or in an establishment where you're made to feel that you don't belong, And it is a horrible and debilitating thing to feel, that you work with people who you see every day, they have little cliques, they go off and do their things. What we need is what you have just brought up, affirmative action. But the moment you start to talk about affirmative action, people start talking about quality and whether there's enough quality in that perspective. And we need to start challenging that.
Yes, I think so, because I know the world is full of talent that can't get through the door. I know you find this, Susanna, and I find this very keenly when I'm auditioning young musicians for the Royal Academy of Music. I'm angered by the educational policy here because, of course, they don't get enough help from the age of 5, which is what you need for a musician. But you have this, by the time I see them at 17, it's too late because they're like athletes that need to have been trained. But don't you think this issue of equality is just such a diversion because it's more to do with access and opportunity for people?
It is a diversion, and access is part of it. The reason I've been confronted as to why there can't be change, the quality thing comes up time and time again. And then the other thing that comes up time and time again is it's a problem in education, there's nothing we can do about it. And there is a problem in education. Of course there is, and that will make a big difference if we can fix that. But there is also so much we can do now. I'm really struck by what you were just saying about relinquishing power, because it's something I think about quite a lot. And in how I run Sound and Music, I do try to do that. But I'm a privileged white middle-class woman with a university education. I have a lot of privilege there. But I think it's funny, the way my mind works, I go from very, very big picture to kind of practical steps forward. And the big picture links to what you're saying about activism, and actually what we need is a complete system change in how we run this world. This is the way it's set up is so patriarchal. It has sort of systems of power which are centuries old. And that can be really overwhelming. I remember sitting in a concert hall about 3 years ago and turning around and seeing a group of people, all of whom I know and like. It was the head of Radio 3, director of the Proms, director of the Royal Opera House, chair of the Royal Opera House, the person who runs Snape Maltings, the person who runs Somerset House, the person who runs a major London orchestra. And they were all white men who were about 60. And there was a pack of them. I was quite taken aback because, and as I say, they're all really nice people, and they're
but
all.
it didn't have to be like that.
And I was like,
they didn't have to be chosen. I was headhunted for that Proms job, and the headhunter made it very clear to me that this was just a courtesy call to a woman.
Oh, great.
They had absolutely no. They really didn't want to put a woman in charge of the Proms.
I think often people are so comfortable in their privilege that they are not able to pick up. They're not sensitive enough to other people's needs. And I think we need to be more sensitive. We need to desensitize ourselves. Those of us who have been given the opportunity to be part of the system, we need to be more receptive to other people's suffering and other people's ways of saying things. And I think often you talk about some of the things you said about people say to you, well, when I see people, I don't see color. I see red mist. Somebody says that to me. Because color, by saying if you look at me, you don't see color, you're denying my presence and my existence. And I will say to you, well, actually, you should see color because you and I are not the same. But that doesn't mean that we can't work together and collaborate to make sure other people who are not as lucky as us would also be given the opportunity to come into the system. Often, I think people need to be a bit more sensitive to other people's needs and feelings and desires and wishes. And I find a lot of people are, in terms of sensitivity, they don't actually feel that there is a need for other people to intervene. We need you to intervene because without you, we can't do what we're trying to do. This is what I'm trying to say. It's not because these people are bad or anything. They have just been schooled and socialized in a system that is made for them. And those of us who are not part of that system, we constantly fall outside that system. And we're knocking on the doors constantly. But it's like nobody hears our knock. We need to do more. You need to be able to be receptive to the needs of those who are not as fortunate as ourselves. And I put myself in there because I'm in the publishing industry now. Somebody who happens to be male and white opened the door for me. So I can't sit here and say, oh, all the men are bad and all the women are good, because it's not that simple, But we all need to work together and make sure that people who are not often, historically regarded as capable to enter the system. We have a lot of talent in the ethnic minorities. I know people, I have worked with people who are absolutely brilliant, who want to get into the publishing industry, but find they're barred by a combination of class, race, disability. It's there. It's like the invisible barriers that exist that we cannot seem to overcome.
So, Nana, I think what we're all saying is everything's got to change at the top for a start, not these kind of underneath interesting roles that people traditionally have. It's absolutely at the top, it's got to change. And I have a friend who is a 60-year-old white male, Oxbridge-educated, used to work at the BBC, who is absolutely livid now. He can't get a job in the arts. And he's complained to me a lot. And I said, listen, you've had your time, move over, But it was this anger that you were talking about, that if you try and raise this, people get a little bit edgy and a bit angry because there's this unspoken rule about who should be in power, perhaps. That's another question here.
So I think a lot of what we've been talking about sort of touches on self-reflexivity of the positions of power. But for me, one of the things that I felt uncomfortable with this conference was the fact that, so for me, I'm mentoring, like I said yesterday, a young person from a similar class background as me, with the added layer of being a person of colour. And one of the biggest barriers for her, even once she wants to study history of art at Oxford, she's very bold. I see similarities, and I see of things that we were told and then things that she's been told on top of that. And a lot of it stems from the fact that we have a marketised system of education. And what I mean by that is that she says she gets told by well-meaning people it's a bad financial decision for you to go and do an arts degree. And the reason for that is university fees. And the fact that this conference is funded by the person that led the report that introduced lifting the cap on tuition fees has made me feel deeply uncomfortable to be here. But I've come and I've spoken because if I don't, I feel then what I want to know really is does it take that funding from like a male BP executive to gather all of these amazing women in a room and to have a conversation? Or actually, would it be more effective to hire a community hall and have working class women of colour speak to people in positions of power?
Perhaps it's not either or, though, is it? Perhaps you need to do both actually, because I think this is quite an important space, and it's very important for people to get together. But it's true that Rachel, you want to say
both. Do both. It isn't an either or, because if you really want to make change and you want it to be endemic and you want it to run through everything, institutions, communities, you have to be doing it everywhere and at every level, and it has to link up in different ways. And people have different aptitudes for different things. And when we, one of the tricks of the the world victory of corporate capitalism is to divide and rule us into thinking this is happening there and this is happening there. Of course we should take the filthy BP money to be able to do this and have this conversation and not be shut down because we're not allowed to have that conversation, which has happened historically, may happen again in the future. We can begin to see somehow of how incursions on freedom of speech are coming. Of course, take the filthy capitalist lucre from wherever it will come. If you can use it to, and you have an awareness, you are aware of it. It's not fooling you, right? You're aware, but at the same time, you may be able to then use that to facilitate, and you can have those other meetings. It's not either or. You're resourceful and you figure out how you can move things around. Yeah. Like all these, I expect that everyone on this platform has stories. Yeah. And like Maria did last night and Barbara, and everyone will have stories about, well, I have this and I have this official fund, but I have other things that I'm doing which create and which enable and so on. So, of course, I understand your discomfort, but also it's perfectly legitimate. If you are going to take off your badge and run down and start protesting outside BP this evening, that's fine, right? Because that's a different situationist moment.
Thank you for that, because I do, part of me thinks like any redistribution of that wealth towards something that has historically been overlooked is good, but equally I was concerned about whether it would sway the political leanings of the discussion, but actually from what I've seen...
Doesn't appear to, no.
Really, does it? And I don't know what my fellow panellists think, but I'm a great believer in working from the inside and doing everything you can to get inside where the power is. I will do anything.
Until they shut you up. Yeah.
Well, then they can try. But, speaking from the outside is good too, but I think inside, because you don't have to be corrupted by it, actually.
And any activism is constantly, one of the fights against activism is to say it's hypocritical to be here. You shouldn't be having the conversation at all because it's hypocritical to be here. So this is another way to stop down debate. So I totally agree. It's like it's both and...
Yes, got another... Yes.
I just wondered if you've got a point just on that.
Oh, sorry, I know I already spoke, but I just wanted to say, but it's a privilege to be able to be inside, and I mean that in that not everyone can be. Like the people who are adversely affected by the BP oil spills, etc., are not here, I don't think, right now. So, it's about, I think that we are complicit and we are affected.
Well, I've got to answer. Anyway, perhaps you and then the other. After that, yeah.
Thank you. I just wondered if, in terms of finding solutions, there's a way to look at how we all view quality. I'm really interested in what you said about the length of female pieces as opposed to male pieces. And I work in dance, and I know that Tonic Theatre did a study on female choreographers and the type of work that they make and the type of work that gets programmed at Sadler's Wells. So females often make work for the Lillian Baylis, which is a much smaller space, and not for the main stage. But we all view work that we see on the main stage with 30 dancers and full length and a massive orchestra as higher quality than intimate pieces that we might see in the Lillian Baylis. We don't do that logically. We wouldn't write that. We wouldn't think that we think that. But I just wonder if we value those things more, and if our institutions are set up to kind of, at the Opera House, it's a much more expensive ticket to go and see Swan Lake than it is to see a triple bill. But what's wrong with making a piece that's 20 minutes and putting it in a triple bill? I'm not saying that women should aspire to less. I'm saying that maybe we should question what we think of is less and more.
Yes, that's a very good, and I think also it's to do with appraisal, isn't it? Maybe unfortunately, artists seek approval and recognition, and they're recognised often by male critics who want to see something huge or only understand it if it comes at them, with enormous proportions, like a huge heavy book or the great American male novel, for example.
But then if you do make something big, whether it's a book or a piece of art or something, then you're presumptuous and it's too big for you to manage.
Well, I was on the Booker Prize panel with Lucy Ellman, which was a fantastic 900-page book, and I can't tell you how people groaned at the thought of reading 900 pages, and it was just fantastic. What a wonderful achievement.
Affirmative action, which I also do support. That if you put somebody into a position that has never had the chance to make a massive work, but they do really want to make a massive work, but they also want to make small works, we have to celebrate those small works and those massive works equally. And I totally want to make a massive work with hundreds of dancers.
I think you're absolutely right. Sorry, I'm going to come to you, but just quickly, there's a composer called John Woorott who writes essentially miniatures, which is very lauded for, but I suspect if a female composer wrote such delicate miniatures, they would think of them as slight and perhaps female or something like that. So I think there is a question of perception very often with that. You know, in his case, it's a man, so very subtle. You know? Please, you've got a question.
Yeah, I wanted to look back and talk about mental well-being, because we talk a lot about wanting to be in these spaces and being on the inside, but where is the support for the mental well-being, especially for women of colour, women especially as well, because I do find women definitely suffer with less confidence in these spaces, and how can we start to create spaces of care and love within institutions? I think like a lot of institutions are missing that. We're missing how we really take care of each other, and it's always about business. But sometimes we, as women, we suffer so much, from heartbreak to looking after our children to so many other. But how do radical self-love within institutions is missing? And I think I was just wondering your opinions about policies that we can put in place to really look after women within institutions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were talking about this, weren't we, Nana? There's a lack of confidence, but it's also something deeper than that, isn't it? It's not. I mean, we all suffer from lack of confidence.
I think one of the things that you will find. I mean, I really enjoyed the Tate director's talk last night. I thought she was incredibly confident, amazing, and what she's achieved. But I sat back and I thought, if I had, or a person of color has stood up and displayed that level of confidence, immediately you would be viewed as somebody who is either aggressive or too loud or not fitting in. All the labels will come out. And, you know, confidence is something we should cultivate in women, because historically, patriarchy has been so dominant in quite a lot of the spaces that we want to enter. And especially for women of color, we need that extra mentoring and support. And that's why I touched on in my introduction about how alarmed and how concerned I felt about the level of women of color, people of color in the publishing industry who have come forward to say, we have suffered mental agonies. And I can completely identify with that. But what are we putting in place? What are the HR departments doing? Because oftentimes I didn't feel I could go to the HR department when I was having problems to ask for help. Because sometimes asking for help is seen as a weakness. You know, this person is not able to cope with the level, the quality, and the work we have to do. So what they will try and do is to ostracize you, to sidestep you, and you will find yourself, again, outside the circle. So we need to find incredible people who are concerned about the welfare of people in the arts, and especially women, disability people, LGBT people, non-binary people, because there's a lot of pushback as well from society about some of these new genders coming on board. And we need to also be aware and awake and alert to their needs and what we can put in place in terms of resources, because I certainly would have probably ended up in some awful place if I didn't have a husband who was so understanding and a family that absolutely supported me. But I also had somebody who opened the door for me, and he was also there to support me. So that is, for me, is a very, very important aspect of what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And Nana, don't you think that perhaps institutionally, I almost think that sometimes institutions simply can't offer the kind of specific support one needs, because as you've rightly said, HR then goes, oh, this person, I have to keep an eye on this person. They're obviously, they're a bit difficult, and maybe, and you don't want that. But so are you saying that maybe it's up to us, as usual, take charge and just create spaces of your own within institutions that are helpful to you?
I think we have to insist
begin
that
with.
Institutions actually make space for those things.
No, I'm not saying that they shouldn't make space, but they're so useless. I think HR departments are hopeless.
I think we should force them to. I think the welfare of your workforce is important, and that includes their mental health. And I think we should actually insist that we have a department that not just does HR, but a department that does looks after the mental health and the well-being of women, people of color, and other people who are not considered fitting in. We need to be aware.
I think this is such an important point. And what I was also going to say is that one of the advantages of being a smaller organisation is, as well as being chief executive, I'm also effectively director of HR. So it is possible for those of us in these leadership. And actually, the point there is that it's not an HR department's, they need to enable it, but you need someone from the top, as Maria did last night, saying this is important. And I think there's a really toxic culture of pretending everything is okay in our society, and particularly in the cultural industries. We talk about institutions, and some of them are absolutely terrible, some of them are better. So Maria's clearly setting a very, a good thing at Tate. If you're a freelancer, you cannot admit weakness. It's really, really toxic. So,
mission of failure.
Yeah, and people won't, you really feel you're not going to get work. So I think we all have to go at this from all angles. If we're in positions of influence, we need to talk openly about our own challenges and to make it okay for people to be okay about the things that aren't great in their life.
But I think also, you and I, we've been in positions where we've commissioned people, we've commissioned composers, and it's up to us to support them, to absolutely support them through the process, and to make sure that we know what they need from us, to make that an entirely happy, productive, and safe experience for them. And some composers need other things, it just depends who they are. And we're in charge of that process, aren't we? It's, it's our responsibility.
Yeah, so I think it's almost like wherever you can, sort of challenge this acceptance, that this accepted culture that you cannot articulate anything about mental health. And, it's for all of us to do that and sort of to change the culture of the industry as a whole, because it's profoundly unhelpful and we lose people and people are hurt, and it's really, we need to change it.
Thank you. Definitely. I'm so much in I like the details of things, because if we just sit here and say, let's just change everything, it's sort of, let's just, maybe, I can see time ticking on. Yes, there's another question.
To create these spaces for us to have these conversations. But we live in a fast-paced neoliberal society where how do you ensure that space can be made in institutions which don't seem to ever have time for you or for your mental health in that way?
Do you find here that there isn't a dedicated space for you to be able to speak to someone, or?
I would say from my own experience that I did have that in a workplace, so I don't know how you do institute that or how you change that.
I'm just thinking of how we look after students at the Royal Academy of Music. We have lots of dedicated spaces because we have people, like here from everywhere, and so we would kind of, and we've really tried to up our game quite a bit because it's such a perilous thing to be a musician. But do you have any thoughts on that space idea about, you've just mentioned that you have to create that yourself all the time. It's an ongoing.
What do you mean for me personally? Or?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I have to. I have quite bad anxiety for various reasons, and so I just have to make sure that I manage being out and about in a thing like this and sort of presenting confidently with having time quietly at home and modelling that to my staff, and acknowledging and appreciating the privilege of my position, which means I get to set the terms of that, and I can also model that to my team and say it's okay for you to do that too. You can work in the way that works for you as well.
Got another question there, and then.
Just in general, tying some of these things together on the issue of mental health and confidence, something that has been touched on, but I think hasn't been discussed too much, is just the very physical differences of being female. So whether that's having a monthly period, if you choose to have children, pregnancy, breastfeeding, maternity leave, and then through the menopause, which is quite high profile in the last year or so. There have been statistics to suggest that something like 20 to 25% of women in the 10 years that they start to experience symptoms lose such confidence that they think about, if not leave the workplace. So I think there are these physical differences that we can't deny in terms of how we move through the workplace, how we feel about our bodies, how hormones affect our levels of belief, confidence, our capacity to tap into our voices as artists, sitting around a boardroom table, feeling, what's my position here? How do I feel about myself and what I'm able to express now? A lot of these physical differences aren't necessarily acknowledged in that process. And is there a place for it? Is it part of the system now? Can we have those conversations? Do you, in your position at the top of the boardroom table, do you feel able to talk about those physical changes? And how does that affect your day-to-day lives?
That's a very interesting. I wonder if women would have different ways of approaching this, actually, that some women would want to be very open about this and other women do not. And we know that people have different experiences as well. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that women who would not want to discuss this are probably worried about judgment and how they will be judged. And again, I go back to my issue of weakness, because if you're constantly talking about your physical attributes and how that affects your work, it's a question of displaying weaknesses you will be judged as somebody who is not capable of, keeping on top of your, if you can't look after your mental and physical faculties, what can you do? So you have to be very careful. But it's about creating a space for women to feel the freedom of discussing these issues, preferably with women. But also, please include men, because a lot of men are very, very susceptible to being able to come on board. And, it's not just about women, because if you have children, you have a man at home, who would be able to see what you're going through. So it's very important to include men. And I feel that we need to talk more about this and not see it as an avenue towards failure or weakness or anything like that.
Sorry, there was just one other question. I'm just aware of the time. Yes.
So I'm Charlotte, for anyone who doesn't know me, and I'm doing my Masters in Music at Cardiff, but I did my undergrad here at Medwards and graduated last year. And I'm doing my dissertation on how bisexual women are misrepresented in the pop music industry. We're very sexualized, fetishized, and also sort of pushed to the side because there's very much this narrative of, I think with the LGBT community, people tend to see cis-het white men and sort of not really anyone else. And particularly like bisexual people suffer from a lot of kind of hate both within and without the LGBT community because it's sort of seen as you can either be gay or straight, but that's neither here nor there. But particularly POC LGBT women or trans women or non-binary people suffer from obviously like threefold of all of the discriminations we've been talking about. And it's just this kind of thing where we live in such a heteronormative society where people feel this pressure to come out because it's seen as something that's different. But at the same time, they sort of don't feel able to do that because it's very hard to find those safe spaces in kind of institutions, and particularly big corporations, because sort of people are worried that they'll be treated differently or might not be accepted at interview or whatever if you kind of flag these things up prior. But at the same time, not everyone wants that to be a staple part of their identity. And I think it very much feels like, as a queer person myself, like you feel this pressure to be your true authentic self, but also that's not everything that I am. And so I just kind of wanted to I just feel like we've touched on kind of queer women a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to really ask the question of what can we do to try and make safe spaces for women in the arts who are queer or non-binary people or trans women particularly who suffer the most, without making it feel like we kind of have to come out and make it such a big deal. How can we try and make it so that it's more safe and inclusive and comfortable for people, where they don't have to feel kind of pressured either way, basically. Yeah.
Just want to be present and there and accepted for who they are, but also be tremendously creative as well. And sorry, did you to say something.
I'm struck by a continuity between the last two questions and points, although they may not seem immediately so. I don't have any particular answers or suggestions, or at least not in in a soundbite. But I do have a historical resource which I'm thinking about, and I've been very struck by what. Sorry, I don't know your name. Hannah. I'd been very struck, Hannah, by what you said and what Charlotte said, is how much it resonated with a historical resource we have of 1970s feminism. Now, I say that with some trepidation because there's a whole kind of sense in which, because of TERFs, because of different kinds of identity politic wars which are going on, that there's this sort of, somehow there's a kind of, oh, well, that represents some kind of, something problematic. But I think it's really important that to remember, just to go back and have a look, that those points, the things that you were saying about what do I do about talking about how I feel when I'm sitting around a boardroom table, my body, all of these things were part of that, whether it's looking back at Doris Lessing, whether it's looking at all those 70s groups where there was those sort of town hall feminism, you were talking about that earlier, about where do we have the meetings and who has access. And the fact that husbands, partners, men were made to come. And because there were different political traditions coming together, because it was something very much still based, you still had a much stronger trade union movement, you still had socialism, the idea of socialism, we said, rather than the word equality, which is politer, was not so discredited because of what had happened in terms of global geopolitics. There's a huge resource there to look at. And so my question I throw back is to say that I've read and heard that, and I read and got hold of that stuff, from when I was younger, and saw some of those things brought into politics and into community activism and organising. And there are theories, there are stories, there are analyses. Whether it's I'm just thinking, I can see all the little ticker tape names going down. Go back and have a look at that and see what the ideas and the theories and the arguments there were, and what's happened and what has worked and what hasn't. And the one thing that hasn't and that has gone awry is exactly what Nana focused on, which is, where did the men go? If you look at the history of the 19th century feminist movement, if you the men are there, right? Now the men are partly there because they're also disenfranchised. They don't have the vote either because they're working class men. All right? So there's a common cause. You can look and you can see whether it's people like, whether it's George Bernard Shaw, whether it's Israel Zangwill, whether it's the working men, the untold story of, or not the untold story, the story we've forgotten that we don't see. That there were commonalities, whether it was Keir Hardie, who was the first leader of the Labour Party, who literally put his leadership of the Labour Party on the line and said, if we don't support the women's vote, I'm out of here. Right? Can you imagine anyone in the current leadership of the Labour Party, a white man, doing that now? Or a white woman, actually, no. So that, I think that sense, and then in the 70s, and I came through that a bit, I had the tail end of that 70s and 80s. No, the men came and they had to, and you'd hold the babies and you must listen, and we're going to talk about menstruation. And conversation about menopause wasn't, so big, but people would talk. So something got lost there. But here's the thing, and I'm trying to sum it out in a nutshell. The difficulty that we're here to think about and unpick is what a man and a woman isn't the same anymore, and we didn't want it to be. The point of feminism was not to occupy the category of woman that we'd inherited, that we didn't want. So this wonderful polyphonic challenge of new languages and different identities that were considered crazy queer theory 40 years ago are now a matter of discussion and debate and horror in The Sun and the Daily Mail on a daily basis, and the Times and the Telegraph and institutions. And it feels like a war, and it is, but it's not a war with guns, and it's a fight. And I think that within it there's a whole new language and a whole new form of liberation. So on the one hand, there's this sort of dichotomy, because we're talking about men and women, and then on the other hand, we're sort of saying who's in and who's out. That's that's something that your generation have to figure out and work with and drag us through and show us how to do. But there is some good news there. It's kind of really exciting as well. And when they fight the hardest, they know they're losing. Don't forget that.
True. That's a clarion call to finish on. Thank you so much. Wonderful questions, wonderful panelists. Thank you.